When we look at the menstrual cycle, now there's so many things happening during a 28-day cycle. Okay, this just shows you all of the things that happen when we actually talk about the menstrual cycle. All right, all of this is happening. All of this is happening. Okay, every one of those things is happening sometimes at the same time. All right, throughout that 28-day cycle. So we're going to look at what hormones are involved with the menstrual cycle. When we talk about the menstrual cycle, there's a lot more female hormones involved with reproduction than there are male hormones. Okay, first and foremost, let's talk about the hormones that are not made in the actual ovaries. Okay, they're not made in the actual reproductive organs. These two hormones are made in the brain. Okay, they're actually not even. They're made at the base of the brain in a tiny little gland called the pituitary. Those hormones are FSH, known as follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Okay, these two right here are made in the pituitary. Oops, Terry, that's totally horribly spelled. But anyway, in the pituitary, and that's like at the bottom of your brain, top of basically your palate, and that gets dumped into the blood and it makes its way all throughout the body and it affects the ovaries. Okay? The kidneys, the stomach, the intestines, the muscles, the eyeballs, all these other organs that this blood is going through, they don't care that FSH or LH are in the blood. The only organ that actually cares is the ovary, because these hormones stimulate the menstrual cycle. Okay? Now, what ends up happening here, FSH, known as follicle stimulating hormone, does exactly what it's called. FSH stimulates follicular development. Because if we look at this 28-day cycle, okay, let's look at 0 here, which is the beginning of the cycle, and 28, which is the end of the cycle. All right? Every one of these cycles, every one of these hormones, it's got to start somewhere. So we know that there's about 4 different cycles going on here. Okay, or 4 different phases. Phase number 1 here, from 0 to about day 5, is known as the flow phase. That's when you actually menstruate. You're getting rid, you'll notice here in this actual image, this shows you that you start off at the beginning with all the previous cycle's endometrium. All this pink stuff here, okay, is actually endometrium, old endometrium that's going to make its way out of the vagina. Through the cervix, out of the vagina, out the vulva. That's what gets absorbed in sanitary napkins, tampons, whatever. Okay? Now, you'll notice that after the actual flow phase, right here, the endometrium is empty. There is no endometrium. It's got to start building itself up again. Okay? So some hormones are involved with that. Before that even starts happening, though, before we even start menstruating, okay, we actually start making a follicle. The follicular phase, even though the flow phase is the first phase in our actual calendar of events, if we start off at 0 and we end at day 28 over here, okay, the flow phase finishes at about day 5. We've got ovulation at 13 to 15, and then we have our luteal phase. We'll talk about all of these. Now, what ends up happening here, at the start, even when you're actually menstruating, inside your ovary, the actual ovary, okay, has nothing to do with menstruation. Menstruation occurs from your uterus. Inside the ovary, though, while the uterus is discharging its old endometrium, the follicle starts to develop. One little follicle is chosen, okay, or is selected in one of the ovaries, and a lot of energy is put into that follicle. And that follicle grows, gets bigger, gets bigger, gets bigger. And while it's doing that, inside it is where the actual little egg is. Okay, this cavity is the follicle. The actual cell is the egg. And the cell, if you look at this, is only as big as this little dot right here. Okay, that's your female gamete. So the follicular phase, follicular stimulation with FSH starts at day 0, and it culminates basically when the actual ovum is fully mature. So we see FSH here, okay? We see FSH in orange. All right, if we look at FSH, here's my orange. Okay, FSH has a little bump right here. Okay? The reason there's a higher amount there is because, oh, look at that. It's stimulating, or it's turning on the actual ovary. Follicular stimulating hormone. It starts to stimulate growth. Okay? You'll also notice that there's another big spike of it further down when we try to get rid of the ovum. When the ovary spits out or releases or ejects the ovum from the actual ovary into the fallopian tube. Okay, so that extra little jab of FSH makes sure that the ovary is like, all right, see you later, egg, go away. Okay? And then we don't see any FSH here. FSH will only start to rise at the end of the cycle because it's going to spike when the next cycle starts. Okay? So that's FSH. Then we have LH, another pituitary hormone. And here's the deal. The pituitary hormone, okay, its jobs, so FSH here starts follicular development, and it also starts the secretion of, so if we look at FSH, FSH is going to start follicular development. So not only does FSH secrete, or it stimulates basically follicular development, it also starts to secrete, or it stimulates the production of estrogen in the ovary. All right, and we're going to talk about what estrogen does later. So LH, on the other hand, also a pituitary hormone. LH's job is to basically promote ovulation. Okay, and the reason LH is low during the entire thing and then spikes midway through and then is low again. LH has one job, and its job is to promote the production of progesterone. The only way it can do that is by getting rid of the egg inside that follicular chamber. Because what grows in the follicular chamber once the egg is gone? The corpus luteum. What does the corpus luteum secrete? Progesterone. So if LH's job is to promote the secretion of progesterone, well, it's got to get rid of the egg. So basically, LH, even though that's not its goal, its goal is to get the ovary to start making progesterone, LH ends up spiking when you ovulate. So if a woman is trying to get pregnant and she hasn't been very successful because her cycles might be off, she might use an ovulation test strip. And that's when you pee on this little strip, and it will tell you what your levels of LH are. There's a grid there when you look at the little key on the container, and it says, okay, you've got this much LH in your urine, because we know that all these hormones, when we have extra of them, they get dumped in the pee. Okay, that's your body's way of getting rid of them, getting them out of the blood when they're not needed. So LH levels get really, really high in and around ovulation. Okay, the next major hormone that we're going to talk about is estrogen. Estrogen and progesterone, both of them, they're the defining female characteristics. Okay, they're what lead, the fact that you have those and you secrete them constantly are what lead to you having female sexual secondary or secondary sexual characteristics. Okay, you'll notice that little girls that are really, really young and prepubescent, let's say, don't tend to have breast development unless they're chubby kids, and those are little kind of fat boobies, like they're not real breasts. Okay? Whatever. Now, as soon as puberty hits and we start to produce female hormones in larger quantities, we see breast development in girls. Okay? We see girls starting to get more of a figure. We see, that kind of shoulder, narrow hip, narrow waist, wider hip development. Okay? We'll start to see, or the person will start to see growth of hair in their pubic area. These are all because of your secondary female, or your secondary female characteristics brought on by estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen has a big job at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. It is very active in the follicular phase. Estrogen does two things. Okay? Estrogen, we'll call it E. Estrogen slowly, and I actually don't like this actual graph. I'm going to draw it this way. Estrogen slowly starts to climb. As estrogen is climbing, we're seeing that the actual follicle is getting more and more developed. Okay, so one of estrogen's jobs is to develop the follicle. Okay? Estrogen's job is to develop the follicle, and its second job, and you'll see this, look at the line I actually drew here, starting and going up and then crashing. Okay, and it actually probably crashes higher, like this. It basically mimics this line that's happening down here. Because the second thing that estrogen does is estrogen starts to build the endometrium. For the first part, for the follicular phase, the green line is basically flat. There is nothing. And then, oh, look at that, it spikes and then it comes down again. Okay? We know that the purpose of luteinizing hormone, LH, is to promote the making of progesterone. So until we have ovulation, till we get rid of that little ovule or ovum in there, we will not make progesterone. Okay, progesterone is only made during the luteal phase. That's the last half of the menstrual cycle. And it's made by this kind of fuzzy looking stuff that ends up filling the inside of that empty follicle that doesn't have the egg in it anymore. Your body makes it by itself. Okay? And what ends up happening is that substance secretes a lot of progesterone. And progesterone, just like estrogen, has two jobs. Number one, P's number one job is to finish the building of the endometrium here. Notice how the endometrium is at its absolute highest when progesterone peaks. Do you see that? Do you see how these two line up perfectly? You'll also notice that estrogen has another little blip here, and it also like pseudo spikes just to give another little kick to the endometrium so that the endometrium can get to its max. This coincides with the same time that a fertilized egg should actually get to the uterus. So the endometrium is at its max then. So progesterone does that. It finishes the endometrium. And the second thing that progesterone does is that it prevents any more little follicles here from starting to develop right away. It makes them wait 2 weeks to ensure that any egg that's already out there has a chance to be fertilized if we want it to be fertilized. And we don't waste making any other eggs in case that one does get fertilized.